Well, we continue our reading of the Bible through the entire year. And again, I'm really hoping these short introductions are being helpful to you, at least to give you some context to what you're reading. And this week's reading, we're going to come from Isaiah 37 through Isaiah 49. Now, in Isaiah 37, Hezekiah is the king of Judah, and this is when the armies of Assyria are attempting to invade Jerusalem and destroy it, just like they did to the northern kingdom before. But Hezekiah, the king of Judah at that time, he sees the danger, and so he seeks out Isaiah's help, and he prays to God for deliverance for Jerusalem. It's always an interesting thing. It seems when the leader is godly, the people respond in godliness. When the leader is wicked, the people follow his example in wickedness. That's about all the political statement I'm going to make. God answers his prayer through Isaiah, and the armies of Assyria are destroyed. Like I said, they couldn't defeat Jerusalem with the siege because how God guided Hezekiah to build Hezekiah's tunnel and bring water into that siege Jerusalem. But more importantly, the Assyrians are destroyed by the angel of the Lord. Been a lot of discussion. Who was the angel of the Lord? Some again will believe that's the pre-incarnate Christ, the Son of God. Hezekiah becomes ill shortly after that, and he's dying. But again, he prays to God. And for this time, he prays for a time of extension of life. And the remarkable thing is God gives it to him. God blesses him with 15 more years of life. But then Hezekiah does a really dumb thing. And out of his comfort and blessing and celebration of life, he falls into pride. And he shows off the treasures of Jerusalem to visitors from far off Babylon. When Isaiah finds out, he says, you're a knucklehead. And how now you've shown all the treasures, the gold, the silver, the rubies, the diamonds. You've shown it to, yes, Babylon's far off, but you just put Jerusalem on Babylon's radar. And of course, in the future, in less than 200 years, Babylon's going to invade. And guess what? They're motivated. They're motivated to gain that gold, silver, and all those treasures. But even with this foolishness of Hezekiah, Chapter 40 extols God's greatness over all the earth, and he does it to encourage Israel. God is still on the throne. And this encouragement comes with a promise in chapter 42 of the coming Messiah, that he would be the one who would ultimately redeem people from their sin and thus protect them from future judgment. There's a promise that Babylon would be destroyed and God will be faithful to Israel, even though they had been unfaithful to him with all this idolatry. In chapter 45, we're going to have the name Cyrus mentioned, who would later conquer Babylon and be used of God to release Jews who at that time were captives in Babylon, those who wanted to return to Jerusalem and rebuild it in 539 BC. It was Cyrus who gave them permission to return to their land. Not a lot of the Jews did, and so many of them stayed in Babylon. Remember, that's what the book of Esther was all about. But what's interesting is that Isaiah was written in the 8th century BC. And that's over 150 years before Cyrus was ever born. And talk about prophetic accuracy and carefulness. Well, Israel continues to be obstinate. It's going to be judged and thus attacked by Babylonians, just like their brothers and sisters were attacked by Assyria up north. But even if there's a promise of future deliverance, for only one reason, God's faithfulness. And that this salvation will not just be for Israel, but that God makes a promise that his salvation will reach the ends of the earth. Well, next week we come to that remarkable passage, chapter 53. Chapter 53 of Isaiah was used by early Christians to basically prove that Jesus Christ was the fulfillment of prophecy of the Messiah, the promised Savior. And yeah, it was very, very interesting. After the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, many Jewish leaders moved up north Palestine, and there was a synagogue that was established up there, a training for future rabbis. And at that time, because Christians were running around showing out of Isaiah 53 that Jesus Christ fulfilled the prophecies, that he was that promised Messiah, that's when the Jewish leaders changed the interpretation of Isaiah 53, and all of a sudden the anointed servant became the nation of Israel. And if you talk to a rabbi today, that's their interpretation. that's going to be through Israel that God would save Israel, which, as if you read through Isaiah 53, you're going to find, and we'll point out next week, that's impossible. The pronouns don't work. So anyway, I'm looking forward to next week, and I'll introduce that to you when we do Isaiah 50 to Isaiah 54. But be faithful and read this section, and we'll pick it up next week. See you then.